They laughed at her the moment she walked through the church doors, wearing an old faded dress, walking slowly with a cane, and holding a worn-out Bible tied with a string. Some whispered. Others chuckled. A few even moved away, pretending not to notice her. Little did they know that this fragile old woman would walk up to that stage and break every single heart in that room. Her name was Margaret. No one remembered her. But after that Sunday morning in a small church in rural Georgia, the entire town would never forget her again. This is her story. Before we dive in, if stories like this move your heart, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing the ones that truly matter. Now, let's begin. It was a quiet Sunday morning in the sleepy town of Elmsbrook, Georgia, the kind of town where everyone knew each other's names, sat in the same pews every week, and exchanged the same polite smiles without ever looking too deep. The First Baptist Church of Elmsbrook stood at the corner of Oak and Main, a modest white building with peeling paint, a creaky bell tower, and a sanctuary that smelled faintly of old hymn books and lemon polish. It wasn't glamorous, but it was home, familiar, predictable, until that morning. The sanctuary was already buzzing with soft chatter and the rustling of bulletins when the doors at the back opened with a slow, hesitant creak. Heads turned. She walked in alone. An elderly woman, perhaps in her late 70s, stepped through the doorway with careful, unsteady steps. Her frame was thin, almost fragile, as if the breeze from the ceiling fan might knock her over. She wore a long, faded blue dress, pressed but clearly old, with a cardigan that hung off her narrow shoulders. Her gray hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and she clutched a fraying leather Bible held together with twine. No one had seen her before, and in a town like Elmsbrook, that meant she didn't belong. Whispers began almost immediately. Who is she? She must have gotten off at the wrong church. Maybe she's homeless. Some of the teenagers snickered. A few adults exchanged uneasy glances. One woman pulled her handbag a little closer. Margaret didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did. But she kept walking. Her cane tapped lightly against the wooden floor with each step, echoing across the sanctuary as if to remind the congregation of her presence. She made her way to the very back pew, alone, and sat down with a soft sigh. Her eyes, pale and tired, scanned the stained glass window behind the pulpit with a distant sadness, as if she was looking for someone who used to be there. Up front, Pastor John pretended not to notice. He adjusted his microphone, smiled at the congregation, and said, "Good morning, everyone," as if nothing unusual had happened. The choir began their first song, and life returned, at least on the surface, to the usual rhythm. But something had shifted, a presence, an unease. As the service moved forward, Margaret remained silent. She didn't sing. She didn't clap. She simply held her Bible close, eyes closed, as if the music brought her pain rather than peace. When the offering plate came by, she reached into a small coin purse and dropped in a single folded dollar bill. A few people nearby exchanged pitying looks, others mocking ones. It wasn't just her clothes or her age or the cane. It was the audacity of her presence. She was poor, she was alone, and she had dared to enter their church. By the time the sermon ended, most had forgotten she was there, until she slowly stood up. She walked toward the front, straight toward the pulpit, and for a moment, the entire church held its breath. Margaret's slow, deliberate walk toward the front of the sanctuary sent a wave of discomfort through the congregation. She didn't belong up there. That space, just below the pulpit, was sacred, reserved for pastors, choir members, and honored guests, not for strangers, not for old women who came in from the street with twine around their Bibles and hand-me-down shoes. And yet, she kept walking. The murmur returned, low at first, but rising like the rustle of leaves before a storm. Pastor John adjusted his microphone nervously, glancing at the elders seated in the front row. He stepped forward, trying to intercept her gently. "Ma'am?" he said, voice low. "Can I help you?" Margaret looked up at him with calm, glassy eyes. There was no fear in them, just a quiet resolve. "Pastor," she said, voice soft but steady. "Would it be all right if I share something with the church? Just a word, or a song." A pause, a long one. Behind them, someone coughed awkwardly. A few teens in the second row stifled laughter. One girl whispered, "She wants to sing?" Her friend covered his mouth to muffle a laugh. Pastor John hesitated. Every instinct told him to politely decline, to preserve the flow of service, to maintain decorum, to avoid embarrassment. But something in Margaret's expression stopped him. A eye, kind of worn dignity, like someone who had waited a long time to be seen. He cleared his throat. "Well, all right, but just briefly, ma'am. We do need to close in prayer soon." Margaret nodded once, the smallest of smiles curling at the edge of her lips. She took the microphone with both hands, steadying herself against the wooden stand. The congregation braced themselves, more whispers. "This is gonna be weird. She's probably senile. Why is the pastor letting this happen?" Margaret looked out, at the room. Row after row of familiar strangers. She could feel their eyes on her, not with curiosity, but with doubt, with dismissal. She didn't speak for a moment, just breathed. And in that silence, the room grew heavier. Then she said, "My name is Margaret Louise Henderson. I was born just a few miles from this church. My parents used to sit right there, third pew from the front. I was baptized in this very sanctuary. Right over there, under the old wooden cross that used to hang before the renovation." A wave of confusion rippled through the crowd. She was from here? "I've been away for a long time," she continued. "Life took me down some hard roads, but the Lord led me back here, and I believe He has something He wants me to share." The girl in the choir smirked. "Oh boy, here we go." Margaret didn't respond. She gently stepped away from the microphone and, without music, without accompaniment, without warning, she began to sing. Her voice was cracked, weathered, fragile, like old paper. But it was real and haunting. She sang the first lines of an old hymn, one many in the room had forgotten, one their grandparents used to hum while sweeping porches or folding laundry. Her voice, though thin, carried decades of sorrow and beauty. But not everyone heard it. At first, the snickering continued. People shifted in their seats. A boy in the back chuckled and whispered, "She sounds like a dying cat." But a few people, just a few, grew still. Their eyes softened. Because there was something in her voice that couldn't be mocked. It wasn't just a song, it was a testimony, a life, a history etched into melody. And before long, the laughter began to die down, because something was happening that no one expected, and they were about to witness the unraveling of their own pride. At first, it was uncomfortable. Margaret's voice cracked in the middle of the second verse. A note slipped out of tune. Someone near the back winced audibly. Others fidgeted in their seats, unsure whether to pity her, mock her, or simply look away. And yet, she kept singing. Not with confidence, not with polished grace, but with something more powerful, conviction. There was no music to cover her flaws, no choir behind her, no lights, no performance, just a trembling old woman, and a hymn that reached into a place no one in that room had touched in years. "Come, ye sinners, poor and needy, weak and wounded, sick and sore." That line, it landed. For reasons no one could explain, the Atmosphere began to change. Slowly, subtly. The smirks faded. Conversations died in throats. Arms uncrossed. People shifted forward in their pews, listening now, not with their ears, but with something deeper. Margaret's eyes remained closed as she sang. Her voice rose, not in volume, but in depth, as if she was climbing out of her own broken past with each word. There was weight in her voice, every lyric soaked in pain and grace. On the second row, a woman named Judith, who'd laughed earlier, felt a lump rising in her throat. She didn't understand why. She hadn't even liked the song. But suddenly, her mind flooded with images of her mother's hands folding laundry, her father kneeling by the bed in prayer, the echo of this very hymn from her childhood Sundays. Behind her, Deacon Miller sat perfectly still, his hands clenched tightly together. He stared at Margaret as if seeing something he had forgotten. Humility, reverence, devotion without decoration. Pastor John swallowed. Hard. He could feel it too. It was like the temperature in the room had dropped, but not in coldness, in clarity. A sacred stillness had settled over the sanctuary, and for the first time that morning, no one dared speak. Margaret reached the final verse. Her voice trembled, barely a whisper now. If you tarry till you're better, you will never come at all. A tear slipped down her cheek, and then, just like that, she stopped. No applause, no dramatic ending, just silence, thick, holy. No one moved. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Something unseen had entered the room and laid bare every heart. And in that moment, Margaret, frail, mocked, unwanted, had become the most powerful person in the building. Not because of her talent, but because of her truth. She slowly opened her eyes. Her hands were shaking. She looked out across the congregation, not with bitterness, not with pride, but with quiet understanding. She saw their red eyes, their lowered heads, their shame, and she said softly, almost like a mother to a child, God still sees you, even when others don't, even when you don't. Then she stepped away from the microphone and sat back down. The sanctuary remained frozen, because no one knew what to say. The laughter was gone, and something far greater had taken its place. The silence that followed Margaret's final words lingered like incense, unshakable, sacred. No one clapped, no one stirred. Even the children, usually squirming by now, sat, perfectly still, as if sensing they had just witnessed something that grown-ups couldn't quite explain. Pastor John blinked rapidly, searching for what to say, but words felt wrong. Too shallow, too rushed, too human. So he didn't speak. Not yet. Margaret sat back in her pew, folding her hands quietly over her Bible once more. Her shoulders were relaxed now, as if a weight had been lifted. Not from her, but from the room. And then it began, not all at once, but like ripples. First, a quiet sob. Someone near the back, a woman in her 40s, face in her hands, trembling. Then another, an older man who hadn't cried since his wife passed 5 years ago. His lips quivered. He tried to hide it, but he couldn't. He looked down at his lap and wept. On the front row, Deacon Miller, always composed, always sharp, removed his glasses, wiped his eyes, and whispered something under his breath. Maybe a prayer, maybe an apology. No one was looking at Margaret with judgment now. They were looking at themselves, not as polished Christians in Sunday clothes, but as broken people in need of something deeper than hymns and sermons. Margaret hadn't dazzled them with skill. She had pierced them with something real. Her voice, though imperfect, had carried a truth none of them had heard in a long, long time. Because they had built walls around their faith, around their comfort, around their lives. And Margaret, in a faded dress and worn-out shoes, had walked in and torn those walls down with a song older than their pride. Pastor John finally stepped forward, but he didn't grab the microphone. He knelt, right there, on the carpet, and began to cry. The congregation watched in stunned silence as their pastor, normally so composed, so professional, covered his face with both hands and let it all pour out. Then others followed. One by one, they moved to the altar, not because they were asked, not because it was planned, but because something inside them had cracked open. Margaret didn't rise. She just watched, peaceful, calm, as if she had seen this before, as if she had prayed for it. And now, it was happening. Judith, the young choir singer who had mocked her earlier, slowly stood up, her makeup smudged with tears. She looked at Margaret, her lips trembling, and mouthed the words, "I'm sorry." Margaret smiled, a soft, forgiving smile that broke Judith all over again. In that moment, everyone in that room understood something profound. God had used the least likely among them to reach the deepest parts of their souls, not through grandeur, but through humility, not through power, but through purity. And as the organist, without instruction, began to softly play a hymn, the congregation joined in, not because it was in the bulletin, but because they needed to sing. Because now they believed. It started in waves, soft at first, like the gentle rustle of leaves before a summer storm. No one had told them to cry. No one had made an altar call. There was no dramatic speech, no emotional music cue, just silence, and then surrender. Judith, the choir girl who had once mocked Margaret with a smirk, was now on her knees near the altar, shoulders trembling. Her friends, who had giggled beside her just minutes before, were sobbing quietly in their seats, mascara smudging down their cheeks like ink on a wet page. One of them whispered, "What just happened?" But no one could answer, because they didn't fully understand it themselves. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't fear. It was exposure. As if, for the first time in a long time, they had been seen, not by Margaret, not even by the pastor, but by God himself. And in that holy reflection, they saw the pride, the judgment, the numbness, and they broke. Tears rolled down the cheeks of men who hadn't cried in years, veterans, fathers, elders. Deacon Miller stood to his feet slowly, looking dazed, like someone waking from a dream. His lips quivered. He turned to his wife, who was sobbing into a handkerchief, and took her, hand in his for the first time in months. No one noticed Margaret anymore, not because she was forgotten, but because the focus had shifted inward. People weren't just feeling emotion, they were confronting themselves. One by one, they began to confess, not with microphones or attention, but in whispers to each other, in handwritten notes slipped across pews, in hugs that meant more than sermons. "I'm sorry I judged you. I've been carrying bitterness for years. I haven't felt God in a long time." And somewhere in the middle of it all, a young boy, maybe 10 years old, walked quietly to Margaret's pew and sat beside her. He didn't say a word. He just reached for her hand and held it. She looked down at him and smiled. Not a wide smile, not theatrical, just the kind of smile that comes from being seen and understood. Pastor John, still seated on the floor, finally stood. His eyes were red. His voice was raw. He didn't preach. He didn't lecture. He simply said, "We forgot how to love." That was it. And yet it felt like the most powerful sermon they had heard in years. Outside the church, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting light through the stained glass windows, painting the sanctuary in soft hues of gold and rose. The same room that had felt so rigid, so cold, was now flooded with warmth, not just from the light, but from humility, from healing. Margaret remained seated, watching the quiet miracle unfold around her. She didn't need recognition. She didn't need applause. Her purpose had been fulfilled, and everyone in that sanctuary would remember this day, not because of a guest speaker or a choir performance or a new sermon series, but because a woman with nothing to prove had walked into their world and reminded them of what it meant to be human and what it meant to be loved. The service, for all intents and purposes, was over. The closing hymn had been sung, not by instruction, but by a spontaneous overflow of broken open hearts. The quiet sobs had softened into peaceful, reflective silence. Pastor John, having finally regained his composure, felt a pull, an urgent spiritual need that drew him away from the pulpit and toward the back of the room. His own sermon, delivered just an hour earlier, felt like dust in his mouth, hollow, meaningless. He had preached about God. This woman, this stranger, had let God speak through her. He walked down the center aisle, his footsteps now quiet, respectful. The few remaining members of the congregation watched him, their eyes following him as he approached the last pew where Margaret still sat, the young boy asleep now with his head resting on her shoulder. The pastor knelt down, not in a gesture of authority, but of humility, bringing himself to her level. "Ma'am," he began, his voice still raw, I don't know what to say, except thank you." Margaret looked at him, her pale eyes holding no triumph, only a deep, abiding peace. She gently patted the sleeping boy's head. "It wasn't me, Pastor. It was the song. The songs always know the way home." He nodded, swallowing hard. There was something else he needed to know, a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. You said your name was Margaret Louise Henderson, and that you were baptized here." "A lifetime ago," she whispered. "That name, Henderson." Pastor John searched his memory, a faint bell ringing somewhere in the deep archives of his mind, a memory from his own childhood, listening to his father's old records. "It's so familiar. Did your family sing?" A faint, sad smile touched Margaret's lips. It was a smile that held the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. "Some people knew me by a different name back then, just for a little while." She paused, looking toward the stained glass window as if seeing a ghost from her past. "They used to call me Maggie Lou." The name struck Pastor John like a bolt of lightning. It couldn't be. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. The high cheekbones hidden beneath wrinkled skin, the elegant line of her jaw, the light in her eyes that even now held a performer's grace. His mind raced back 30, 40 years. Maggie Lou Henderson. The Georgia Sparrow. A name whispered on old gospel vinyls, a voice that had been a rising star on the Southern Revival circuit in the late 1960s. A voice so pure, so anointed, it was said she could make angels weep. She had 2 hit records, radio play, and was on the verge of national stardom, a new voice to rival the greats. And then she had vanished, completely. No farewell tour, no explanation. One day she was on every gospel station in the South. The next, she was gone, a mystery that became a quiet legend. You're Maggie Lou?" the pastor breathed, his voice filled with disbelief and awe. "You're the Maggie Lou Henderson? What happened? Where did you go?" The pain in Margaret's eyes was soft, ancient. "My mother got sick," she said simply, as if that explained everything. "Alzheimer's. It took her from us piece by piece over 20 years. She needed me. My career, my songs, they could wait. She couldn't." The truth landed in the sanctuary with a deafening silence. The woman they had judged as homeless, as worthless, as a nuisance, was a legend. A titan of the faith who had given up fame, fortune, and a future brighter than anyone in that room could imagine, all for the sacred, thankless duty of caring for her dying mother. She had chosen love over glory, service over stardom. She hadn't lost her fortune. She had sacrificed it on the altar of love. Pastor John looked at her worn-out dress, her calloused hands, the twine holding her Bible together, and he finally understood. This wasn't poverty. This was holiness. The pastor's stunned whisper, "You're Maggie Lou?" did not stay at the back of the church. It traveled through the silent, sacred air like a shock wave, passing from ear to ear, from heart to heart. It wasn't gossip. It was a confession, a revelation that reframed everything that had happened that morning. And in that moment, a profound and unshakable karma settled over the room. The seeds of judgment, planted so carelessly just an hour before, had come to harvest. Judith, the choir singer, felt it most acutely. She stood frozen near the altar, the weight of her own shallow mockery crushing her. She looked over at her friends, hoping for some shared glance, some way to dismiss the feeling, but they wouldn't meet her eyes. Their faces were buried in their hands, lost in their own private shame. Her sharp, cynical voice, usually the center of her social circle, now felt like a curse. She had tried to make Margaret invisible, and in doing so had become invisible herself. The teenagers who had snickered now sat stone-faced, staring at the floor. The woman who had clutched her purse tighter now held it loosely in her lap, her hands trembling. They were no longer part of a comfortable majority. They were isolated islands of regret. The very judgment they had cast upon Margaret had now turned back on them, not from others, but from within their own souls. It was a quiet, suffocating verdict. But as the proud were brought low, the humble were lifted up. A shift occurred in the church's unspoken hierarchy. The quietest souls in the room, the ones who usually slipped out unnoticed after the service, were the ones who seemed to understand the moment best. Old Mr. Abernathy, the church groundskeeper, who had tended the gardens for 40 years without a word of thanks, walked slowly up to Margaret. He didn't see a gospel legend. He saw a fellow traveler. He simply touched the brim of his worn hat and said, "That was a fine song, ma'am, a real fine song." A widow who always sat alone in the third pew, who many thought was unfriendly, was now seen comforting one of the weeping teenagers. The social walls, built on status and appearance, had crumbled into dust. Pastor John, now standing, watched this quiet revolution unfold. He saw Deacon Miller, a man known for his wealth and business acumen, walk over to Mr. Abernathy and shake his hand, not as an employer to an employee, but as a brother. For the first time, people were seeing each other not for what they had, but for who they were. The Church of Elmsbrook was never the same after that Sunday. The comfortable predictability was gone, replaced by a raw, humbling authenticity. The peeling paint and creaky floors remained, but the foundation beneath them had been irrevocably altered. It was no longer a social club that met on Sundays. It was a hospital for the broken, a sanctuary. And Margaret, the catalyst for it all, remained a figure of serene stillness. She hadn't sought revenge or vindication. She didn't need to. Karma wasn't a punishment she had delivered. It was a natural law that had simply been revealed. Everyone in the end had to live with the person they had chosen to be that morning. For some, it was a heavy burden. For others, it was a quiet liberation. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, flooding the sanctuary with a light that seemed to cleanse the very air. The service that was meant to end an hour ago had found a new beginning. Pastor John, with a humility he had never known, walked back to the pulpit. He looked out not at a congregation, but at a family of survivors who had just passed through a storm of their own making. His voice, when he spoke, was not the confident, booming tone of a preacher, but the quiet, broken voice of a man confessing. "Today," he began, his eyes scanning the faces before him, "we were given a test, and we failed." A hush fell over the room. "We failed because we have spent years building a comfortable church, but we forgot how to build a loving one. We learned hymns, but forgot how to listen. We looked at a messenger from God, and we saw only a poor old woman." His gaze fell upon Margaret, who was still sitting quietly in the back. "On behalf of the First Baptist Church of Elmsbrook," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want to apologize to you, Ms. Henderson, not just for our judgment, but for our blindness. You showed us more of God's heart in one song than I have in 1,000 sermons. We are in your debt." He didn't need to ask for a vote. Every head in the room nodded in solemn agreement. The apology hung in the air, not as a solution, but as a starting point. It was then that Judith, her face streaked with tears, found the strength to stand. She walked on trembling legs down the aisle, past the pastor, and knelt before the pew where Margaret sat. She couldn't speak at first. Her sobs were too great. I'm so sorry," she finally choked out. "What I said, what I thought, it was ugly. It was evil. How can you even look at me?" Margaret reached out a gentle, wrinkled hand and placed it on Judith's head. She didn't offer a simple, easy forgiveness. She offered something more profound: grace. "Child," she said softly, "the person you were an hour ago is not the person you are now. That is the miracle. Don't look back at the darkness. Look at the light that broke through it. That light is what matters to God, and it's all that should matter to you." That moment of grace was the final key. It unlocked the last vestiges of pride in the room. What followed was not a return to normalcy, but the birth of a new one. People stayed long after the service should have ended, not talking about weather or football, but about faith, about their own lives, about the song Margaret had sung. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, Margaret slowly stood up. The sleeping boy next to her stirred, and she gave his hand a gentle squeeze before letting go. Her work was done. She hadn't come to be celebrated or to reclaim her fame. She had come to deliver a message, and it had been received. As quietly as she had arrived, she turned and began to walk toward the doors. Pastor John saw her, and his first instinct was to stop her, to offer her a place of honor, to beg her to stay. But he understood. To put her on a pedestal would be to miss the point entirely. She wasn't a celebrity to be worshipped. She was a lesson to be lived. He simply watched as the frail, powerful woman who had shattered and rebuilt his church pushed open the doors and stepped back out into the world, disappearing as quietly as she came. She hadn't come to join them. She had come to plow the hardened soil of their hearts so that something new and beautiful could finally grow. The heavy oak doors of the First Baptist Church of Elmsbrook swung shut, not with a bang, but with a soft, final click. It was the sound of a chapter closing and a new one beginning. Inside, the congregation remained, not in their pews, but standing in small groups, talking in hushed, earnest tones. The air was different. The light was different. They were different. Margaret was gone, but her presence was more powerful in her absence than it had ever been. What is a miracle? Perhaps it is not always a parting of seas or a healing of the blind. Sometimes a miracle is quieter. Sometimes it is the shattering of pride in a room full of comfortable people. Sometimes it is the simple, earth-shaking truth of a forgotten hymn. The people of Elmsbrook had spent their lives looking for God in the thunder of a powerful sermon, in the polished performance of a choir, in the gleaming wood of their pews. But he had arrived in the whisper of a broken voice. That Sunday, they learned a lesson that would be etched into the soul of their town forever. Never, ever judge a soul by the vessel it inhabits. They had looked at Margaret and seen a faded dress, a frail body, and a life they assumed was empty. They saw what was on the outside and dismissed it as worthless. But they were blind. They failed to see that her faded dress was a robe of humility. Her tired hands were instruments of grace, and her worn-out Bible, held together by string, contained a faith more valuable than all the gold in the world. For it is often God's way to use the smallest, most forgotten vessel to pour out the greatest lesson, to shame the wise with the simple, and to humble the strong with the weak. Margaret asked for nothing, no recognition, no applause, no honor, and in asking for nothing, she was given everything, the power to change hearts, to heal a community, and to remind them of who they were truly meant to be. No one in Elmsbrook ever saw Margaret Louise Henderson again. Some said she moved on to the next town, a quiet pilgrim on a long road home. Others whispered she was an angel sent for a single purpose. But it didn't matter where she went. What mattered was what she left behind. The First Baptist Church was reborn. The sermons became simpler, the music became more soulful, and the doors were always open, truly open, to anyone and everyone, no matter how they were dressed or what they carried in their hands. The story of the Sunday Margaret came became a local legend, a sacred memory passed down to children and grandchildren, a constant reminder to look deeper, to love better, and to listen for the song beneath the silence. Her name was Margaret. They had laughed at her, and they would never forget her. And the question that lingered in the air long after she was gone, the one that settled in the heart of that small Georgia town, is one we must all ask ourselves. Who have we failed to see today?